with Murray and Irving than, this story would lead you to believe. The other thing is, I think the Celtics are a little bit frustrated right now because, as we're going to talk about in a second, they're not being talked about in the NBA a whole lot right now. At the time of this recording, they're 6-4. Denver is a team that's 9-1. The Bucks, even in the East, are a team that's got one loss. And then the Raptors only have one loss. The Celtics are kind of mid-level in those playoff positions right now. They're not being talked about as much as even we thought they would be, kind of a shoe-in. And right now it looks like it might be a bit more of a challenge. So to me, I think this comes down to more of a frustration by Kyrie Irving than Jamal Murray doing anything wrong.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. This is just basically a poor start by the Celtics. They're not where they wanted to be. They're not where they thought they would be. They go into Denver. They're actually up in that game in the first half, and then they end up getting beat late basically because Jamal Murray went nuts and couldn't miss, it felt like. And this is the guy that, look, how many times are you going to get in the NBA a chance to break that 50-point mark? So why not shoot it up? At that point, from a line standpoint, it didn't have anything to do with the line. I think the Nuggets were a 2-point favorite in that matchup. So, yeah, Kyrie's just frustrated, and he took it out on that particular spot. I think he would have still been mad after the game if Jamal Murray just dribbled it out at that point. He still would have been mad. But, Eric, you came up with a really good point there about the Celtics team and some of their frustration in the fact that they're starting to look up at a few teams. And one in particular, we didn't think they would be looking up at this point, and that's the Milwaukee Bucks. We talked about this team in the preview show, but more from a Giannis standpoint and what we thought we'd see out of him this year. Not necessarily that this Bucks team would be 8-1 through 9 games, and they're getting ready here on Tuesday night as we record to play the Portland Trail Blazers. But, Eric, is this Bucks team for real, and can they challenge for the East?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In our preview show, obviously Giannis was hot on our minds. He's a great player. We knew he was going to be a great player, but we didn't think too much about the Bucks as a whole. Partly because they're the Milwaukee Bucks. They're just not a sexy team. They're not someone who's in the news a lot. That's not a team that gets a lot of buzz. But yeah, I actually am starting to believe in this Bucks team because at 8-1, they've actually had wins, convincing wins over the 76ers. They've had a win convincingly over the Raptors, who are 10-1. The only game they lost was just by 4 points to those Boston Celtics. So obviously, with Boston being a team that we thought was going to be good in the East, that loss doesn't make you feel real bad. Same way I said about the Rams losing to the Saints. When you lose to another good team, it doesn't make you feel awful about your team. We'll see what they do tonight as we record against Portland. Coming up, though, Justin, is I think where we're going to find out about these Bucks, because in the next week or so, they've got to play the Warriors, the Clippers, and then they've got Denver a couple of times. So that's where we're going to start to see a little bit more if the Bucks are for real or not. They do have some quality wins so far this year. Giannis has played like a monster. I mean, the guy is just so fun to watch. I can't say his last name like you can, but he is fun to watch. It's just this Milwaukee team. They just don't create a lot of buzz around the league because they're not flashy. I think Giannis would be a superstar if he played somewhere else because he would be everywhere. But yeah, this team could be scary. And I think, again, with the Kyrie thing, although the Celtics did get that win last Thursday over the Bucks, I think it's just the fact that you've got these other teams playing better than the Celtics, and this Bucks team being one of them, that leads to that. So yeah, the Bucks could be for real. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, I don't think it's all on us to overlook Milwaukee. They really underachieved last year. They didn't perform close to the team I think that we even thought they would be last year, that Giannis would take a step forward and this team would play much better. They just kind of fell apart, so they made the head coaching change. Then they went out and they signed Brook Lopez. They drafted Dante DiVincenzo, and they added some depth on this team, some shooting. You've seen Giannis, his game. He's starting to develop that jump shot a little bit more. They're starting to use him in the post a little bit more, his ability to get to the rack. And you talk about him being underrated. Chris Middleton's another guy on that team that's completely overlooked. That guy can flat fill it up every night. He's a guy that can get you 20 points. So they're a very solid basketball team. When it comes to playoff time, when they get in these 7-game series, I think the move to Mike Budenholzer is going to make a difference for this team, having a head coach that they're confident in as a unit. But I think it's still going to be tough with Boston. I think Boston's going to continue to improve. We talk about the Lakers early on trying to figure out their rotations. Boston's doing the same thing. They played so much last year without Kyrie Irving down the stretch. They didn't have Gordon Hayward. They're trying to fit those two guys back in, along with how Tatum's coming along. Jaylen Brown's been out for this team, one of their best defensive players. So there's a lot of moving parts to Boston that as the season goes on, they're going to get hot. They're going to rip off a big win streak I see coming out of them, or some stretches where they're 8-2, 9-1 in 10-game stretches. So I look for them to continue to play better. But Milwaukee's definitely got to be a team that's considered in the top four. And right now, frankly, the way Philadelphia is playing, I think they may have jumped Philly into maybe that 2 or 3 spot right now. Toronto's on a roll. I look for Boston to continue to get better. But, yeah, very impressed with Milwaukee and Toronto right out of the gate, how they've just shot to the top of the East.
Well, as you know from past episodes, when you hear that sound, that means there's late breaking news. The bad part about Justin and I having full-time jobs is that we have to record this podcast when it fits our schedules. Most of the time, that's on a Tuesday night. So we were in the studio last night recording the entire show for episode 224. Then on Wednesday, we're at work and we're reading these breaking news things come across our Twitter. We look at it and find out there are a couple major stories. One of them coming out of NASCAR, which really had to be addressed because in the teaser of this show, I had mentioned that there wasn't really much to talk about from the world of NASCAR after the Texas Motor Speedway race that Kevin Harvick won. That turns out now not to be true. So we're back in the studio here Wednesday night recording a breaking news update. So with that, I'm going to send it over to you, Justin.
So 2 breaking news stories happened on Wednesday. Let's cover the first with NASCAR. They announced on Wednesday morning the penalties to Kevin Harvick's number 4 team that encumbers his win. That's a word we haven't heard since last year, where if you win a race and there's a penalty, the win no longer counts in terms of the playoffs. For Kevin Harvick, that means he is no longer locked into Miami. He also was docked 40 points, which drops him down to 4th in the playoff point system right here in the round of 8. He's only 3 points ahead of 5th place Kurt Busch, only 17 ahead of Chase Elliott. And he's lost his crew chief and car chief for the next 2 races. Stewart-Haas announced they would not appeal these penalties. Obviously, Eric, this is an enormous story in terms of the world of NASCAR, where you have a driver that looked to be locked in, that we know is going to go to Homestead, Miami, and have plenty of speed to be a contender for this championship. Now they're only a few days away from Phoenix with practice and the team traveling over. It's already Wednesday. If you're familiar with NASCAR, most of the teams are on the East Coast in the Charlotte area. They're going to have to transport those cars across the country to Phoenix. So many of those teams will probably start to leave this evening to make sure they're there by Friday. So a major penalty for this number 4 Stewart-Haas racing team. So let me ask you, Eric, we left Sunday. NASCAR seems to be the only sport out there where what you see and the results you see sometimes don't seem to hold true. We never have covered an NFL game where what happened on Sunday is not actually the results that we find out on Wednesday. So is NASCAR issuing this penalty on a Wednesday morning fair to Kevin Harvick and his team?
I say it's fair only because this is the precedent that NASCAR has set, and it's been this way for many, many years. So outside of the fact that it's really important right now because the playoffs are ongoing and we've got one more race before the finale in Homestead, the timing of it seems odd. But this is something that, as you said, has happened in NASCAR for many, many years. What I would be more disappointed with than NASCAR in this situation right now is actually Kevin Harvick's team. You have a guy who's had speed all year long, and why they're messing around with the spoiler and putting themselves in this position to compromise their chances at a championship is beyond me. Now, not only do you lose that win, it becomes encumbered, it invalidates it, you don't get that punch ticket to Miami that we've kept talking about the past 2 weeks. You also lose those 40 points, putting him in dire need of either a win or a very high finish in Phoenix. He could also be kicked out if a guy like Kurt Busch or Chase Elliott or Eric Almirola jump up and win the race in Phoenix, because that locks them in and it shifts everybody else down who's trying to get in points. If I'm the crew chief of Kevin Harvick's team, I don't know why I'm trying to circumvent the rules right now. It just seems way too risky, and this is a very stiff penalty for this team. They've had speed all year. I don't think they needed it to get in. I really don't even think they needed it to potentially win that race in Texas. It's hard to say. We don't know what advantage that gave them, but NASCAR thinks it was an advantage. And so, yeah, it's goofy. I agree with you, Justin. It's the only sport that we know of that you come back a few days later and find out that something is different. You might have referees apologize in the NFL or the NBA and say, yeah, we missed a call, but it doesn't change the outcome. This significantly changes the outcome because we go into Phoenix with a whole lot of stress if we're the number 4 team.
I think that's my problem with it is this was on Sunday, even as a show like us that's recording a podcast on a Tuesday night, we should know the results of the race. We should be able to bring those up without having to come back through and clean up something from NASCAR. NASCAR has hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars worth of technology at the racetrack that they should be able to find out if this stuff happens and make a call right there. You shouldn't have this kind of gap. And I don't think it's fair to Harvick's team. Look, yes, they broke the rule. Ryan Blaney's team got a penalty after this race. Eric Jones' team got a penalty after this race. So if you're not pushing the envelope as close as these cars are running, for a team like Kevin Harvick, if they don't go there, they're liable to end up in the teens or getting a lap down in this race, and then they're in the same position anyway. So all these teams are pushing the envelope. I just feel that NASCAR, with all the technology that's out there, they've got to find a way to make these calls at the racetrack. Fans that went to that race now shouldn't feel like, well, I guess Kevin Harvick won, but not officially, but he did officially, and he's still a win. It still counts, but it doesn't count. Like, that doesn't make any sense. We're not talking this morning about, oh, yeah, Sunday night, the Patriots actually, that doesn't count as a win because this happened during the game, so the NFL encumbered that win, so if they're in a tiebreaker, it doesn't count. You don't see that from any other sport but NASCAR. So I think that's one thing that they've got to fix. They've got to change this rule. If they can't figure out what's going on at the racetrack when that car goes through, either pre-tech, post-tech, just leave it alone at that point because this is what hurts the sport. Even with the audience being nearly the same as it was last year, you didn't have a big drop in numbers. You had a pretty good race. You had what we talked about even earlier in the show with Harvick having that moment with the fan. Now, all that stuff's going to be forgotten because of this penalty. I also don't like the Wednesday ruling, Eric, even if they came out on Monday. But Wednesday, this team is getting ready to travel to Phoenix, and now their mindset is completely different. They've lost their crew chief. They've lost their car chief. And they have to have a completely different mindset now going into Phoenix. So that's my problem with it. I agree. Maybe they shouldn't be pushing it, but Eric, I think everybody else is pushing it to the point that if you don't and you're not trying to work in that gray area, you're going to fall behind and you're not going to be able to even advance in these rounds. So I really think NASCAR needs to fix that just from a fan standpoint. It's not fair to fans to have to wait what's going to happen after Homestead? Are we going to see a champion crowned and then 3 days later, there's a possibility what we saw didn't really happen? I mean, that's something NASCAR's got to consider at this point. How can that race not count? Is that car then not the champion? I think NASCAR's opened Pandora's box here, Eric, as they get ready to close out their season in 2 races.
Yeah, I think that's actually an interesting point that I hadn't thought of. I mean, a crew chief and a car chief, what would they do? Suspend them for the next 2 races? So what? You'd be out for the Daytona 500 and the race after that the following season. But if they still go home with a championship, that's a small price to pay. I see your point on that for sure. And I'm going to bill NASCAR for the additional time on this Wednesday night for having us come back into the studio and re-edit parts of this podcast.
Well, let's finish up this episode. Hopefully we're not back with more breaking news. But the other big story that broke on Wednesday morning was Des Bryant signing officially with the Saints on a 1-year deal. He actually had worked out on Tuesday, but Des had also met with the Browns earlier this year, and that didn't work out, even though he was offered a $5 million contract with some incentives built in there. But he does ink a deal with the Saints. We just talked about the Saints in segment 1 of this show as potentially being the best team in the NFC. Now, Eric, this is a team that has been razor thin at the wide receiver position ever since they lost Ted Ginn Jr. They've been trotting out their rookie Traquan Smith. Cam Meredith has been in and out of the lineup, so they definitely need help at the wide receiver position. But we have seen that Des Bryant can be a powder keg and sort of a disruptive force to a football team. So do you like the Saints taking the gamble on Des Bryant?
Oh, yeah, I definitely do. It's not a whole lot of risk for them. It's a 1-year deal. It's not like they laid a bunch of cash out to make this happen over the next 3 to 4 years. They're putting a piece in place that might help them get to and win a Super Bowl. And he doesn't have to be the number 1 guy. He doesn't have to be wide receiver 1. We talked about Michael Thomas, coincidentally, earlier in this episode. So when you just add Des Bryant as a piece to an offense that clearly is functioning quite well already, I don't think there's a lot of risk because Des should know his place on this team. He's not the superstar coming into this team. He's Des Bryant, who the Saints are doing him a favor because they might provide him an opportunity to re-show the league what he can do and then maybe get a job for next year. So if it doesn't work out, they can cut him. I don't think there's a whole lot of risk for the Saints, and I think there's, if anything, a lot of upside if he ends up working out and playing a great wide receiver 2 position for them.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that. I think the move because the fact that Michael Thomas is there and the fact that you have Alvin Kamara there, two guys that basically are going to be options 1